The policy of separating immigrant and asylum-seeking children from their parents, it has slowly slipped away from the day-to-day headlines coming out of D.C. And to hear the Trump administration refer to the policy, the whole thing you would think is pretty much over. It is not. And we are getting a look at some data that confirms that. While more than 2,000 children were reunited with their parents in the past couple of weeks, more than 700 young kids remain in federal custody, often in cages. And according to the numbers released by the administration, more than half of those kids, 431 of them, they cannot be released. Why, you ask? Because their parents have already been deported. The government cannot locate the parents of another 94 children, and some families are facing other legal issues as well. Now, in a court hearing yesterday, the administration dropped another head-scratching decision related to these kids. They want the ACLU and other groups who are suing to end family separations to take on the burden of locating those parents who have already been deported. The Trump administration, which took the children, either doesn't want to or doesn't think it can find all the parents that they have already kicked out of the country. Now this, as reports continue to filter in, of the trauma these kids are facing while often in custody. The latest, a worker at a shelter in Arizona, at a single shelter, accused of molesting 8 children, as they were left to wonder how many other reports this will turn up, and also how many other incidents have happened but will go unreported. Our next guest, he knows better than most the toll that these family separation and its policy is having on these children. Dr. Alfonso Mercado, he is a clinical psychologist. He's been working with children and families in the border communities. He's also a professor at the University of Texas-Rio Grande Valley. Doctor, thank you very much for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's try and start from the beginning, before these families or these children get to our borders or cross them. Talk about the trek that they go through and also what they're fleeing from.
Well, Richard, what we have to understand is that these children and families are fleeing trauma, many times torture in their home countries. So they have that pre-existing trauma symptoms that they have, in addition to a migratory trauma that many times they encounter. And then once they hit here in the U.S., problems like these, when we see the separation, that's additional trauma that they encounter. So we're looking at multiple events upon multiple events, exacerbating pre-existing symptoms of mental health, really having psychiatric emergencies in many situations.
In Dr. how the separations are taking place when parent and child come here together, you can speak to this firsthand. As we understand it, they're not prepared. They don't know that they're about to have their child taken away from him. In some cases, it's done surreptitiously. They'll be removed for a moment, and then they don't see him again for days, weeks, months, or in some cases now, even longer than that. They weren't prepared for that. I can only imagine the traumatic effect it had on the parent and obviously on the child.
Correct. Many of these families don't know that the family separation will occur. I have seen these families, children and the parents, both in research settings and clinical settings here in the Rio Grande Valley. We have the border right in our backyards, and I do consult with many of these entities in which I provide psychological assistance and support. Some of these families have fallen through the cracks. Some of these families don't know what will occur. This is not happening to every single family that comes through the border seeking asylum. Helping out a local humanitarian respite center. We have families and the children together. But there are an abundance of families, as you reiterated the numbers, where family separation did occur. When and how they're doing that, we don't know. But we are looking at extensive, trauma symptoms, both in the parents and the children upon that separation, having long-term, short-term psychological effects and damage.
I just reported, Doctor, what ProPublica uncovered, which was at least 8 young men, young boys, I should say, all minors, were sexually assaulted at that Mesa, Arizona facility. And while we pray that this is the outlier here that has happened, nonetheless, the idea that the government, ICE officials on Tuesday compared to the detainment of these children as the equivalent of summer camp. I'm curious, as a mental health professional, but also just a human being who's seen this firsthand, what was your reaction when you heard that analogy?
So we know that, these shelters and detention centers, many times they're not well equipped to provide adequate mental health services. And like I stated before, if we're looking at pre-existing trauma, migratory trauma that they experience, and then additional events here that, we're looking at an emergency where physical mental health aid is warranted. We're not looking at summer camp. We're not looking at regular summer camp counselors that are available in these facilities. These are facilities where, their basic needs, are met. But as far as medical and psychological services, that is questionable.
I heard a comment from a couple parents now after being reunified with their children where they said the equivalent, Doctor, of, it's not the same child that I last saw. They're different. They've been changed. Whether one described it that they feel that the child abandoned them, or another one where the child's just been hardened and it's not the kid that they brought into this country. Can you explain that in layman's terms, where really what these families are encountering and how especially this traumatic event can really shape a child?
Those are common trauma symptoms that children experience. Upon family separation, we're looking at short-term psychological effects in addition to long-term psychological effects. We're looking at their emotional, cognitive, and physical health being impaired. And we're looking at this is a type of abuse, really, if we look at it, where we're looking at immediate psychological damage, when we're looking at attachment with the caregiver and the child, and when that is halted and affected, we're looking at, development of a mental health disorder like acute stress disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. Long-term effects include substance use, development of post-traumatic stress disorder, behavioral difficulties, academic, problems as well. And there's an array of problems that we do see, long-term wise when we're looking at trauma events like family separation.
Finally, Doctor, I doubt there'll be much in the way, at least with the current group, of curiosity or trying to do a post-mortem to make sure we don't make this kind of national mistake again. But hypothetically, if someone asked you to sit down in the Oval and explain what we've done with this policy and just how far-ranging it is, the consequences, if you're going to try and get through to somebody, can you describe just the scope of what we've done to these thousands of kids and their families?
It is apparent that no medical professional was consulted when they decided to employ this zero-tolerance family separation. This is a type of abuse. We're looking at trauma symptoms. We're looking at, I'm seeing children here on the border that had minimal to no mental health symptoms before this happened. And now these children are nonverbal, they don't communicate, and many of them are soiling themselves. So we're looking at significant mental health problems that, were ignored when these decisions were made.
Dr. Mercado, thank you not just for your time, but also the work that you're doing in South Texas. I appreciate it on both accounts here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
All right, everyone, when we come back, we're going to come closer to home, talking about policing minor crimes, quality of life stuff to help prevent the bigger crimes. You remember the whole idea behind broken windows, that whole policing strategy here, and it sparked controversy in New York City for decades. Now, we're going to bring on a Yale, both attorney and sociologist, who asked some pretty pointed questions about the policies and their cost to society and the tens of thousands of New Yorkers who got thrust in the legal system as a consequence. Stay with us. That conversation straight ahead.